The first time Robert Mercer noticed footprints crossing his south field, he dismissed it as neighborhood kids taking a shortcut. The second time, when he spotted flattened crops and a clear path from the Oak Ridge Estate's fence line to the creek, he frowned but still chalked it up to curious teenagers. By the third time, when he discovered discarded food wrappers and plastic bottles scattered across his carefully tended soil, Robert's patience evaporated like morning dew under the harsh summer sun. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered, stooping to collect an empty potato chip bag embedded in the soft earth beside his heirloom tomatoes. His weathered hands, calloused from 30 years of working this same parcel of land, trembled slightly with suppressed anger. At 62, Robert wasn't the confrontational type. He'd purchased these 40 acres when the surrounding area had been nothing but other farms and open countryside. He'd raised his family here, buried his wife in the small cemetery plot on the North Ridge, and planned to live out his remaining years in the peace and quiet he'd earned. The last thing he needed was a battle with trespassers. But that was before Oak Ridge Estates had sprung up along his eastern boundary 3 years ago. Before the sprawling subdivision with its uniform houses, manicured lawns, and restrictive covenants had become his unwanted neighbor. And long before its residents had apparently decided his private property was their personal recreation area. The following morning, Robert walked the property line, coffee mug in hand, surveying the damage. The path was becoming more defined with each passing day, a clear trail worn through his crops leading from a gap in the decorative fence that marked the boundary of Oak Ridge Estates down to the small creek that ran through the western portion of his land. You could see why they'd want access. The creek featured a charming natural swimming hole surrounded by century-old oak trees. It was picturesque, secluded, and completely on his property. "Excuse me, sir." A sharp female voice cut through his thoughts. Robert turned to find a petite woman in a crisp white blouse and pressed khaki pants, striding purposefully across his field, crushing more of his crops with every step. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and despite the early hour, her makeup was flawless. "Can I help you?" Robert asked, making no effort to mask his irritation. "I'm Deborah Winters, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She extended a manicured hand that Robert deliberately didn't shake. Unfazed, she continued, "I wanted to discuss the access path to the creek." "Access path?" Robert echoed, disbelief coloring his voice. "You mean the illegal trail your residents have worn through my private property?" Deborah's smile tightened. "Well, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss. Several of our homeowners have mentioned how much they enjoy the creek area, and we thought it would be beneficial to formalize the arrangement." "Formalize?" Robert felt his blood pressure rising. "There is no arrangement to formalize. This is private property. My property." "Yes, technically," she conceded with a dismissive wave of her hand. "But surely you can understand that waterfront access significantly increases our property values. The HOA board was thinking we could come to some sort of agreement, perhaps a small easement." Robert stared at her, momentarily speechless. The audacity was breathtaking. "Ms. Winters," he finally managed, setting his coffee mug down on a fence post before he was tempted to throw it, "there will be no easement. There will be no access. This is a working farm, not a public park. Please inform your residents that they are trespassing, and I expect it to stop immediately." Her pleasant expression vanished. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the influence our HOA wields in this county. We have members on the Planning Commission, the Zoning Board." "Is that a threat?" Robert interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course not. Just a reality check." She handed him a business card. "Think about it. We can make this worth your while." The week following his encounter with Deborah Winters proved that the Oak Ridge Estates HOA had no intention of respecting Robert's property rights. If anything, the trespassing increased, with entire families now picnicking by his creek on weekends. Robert documented everything meticulously, taking photographs, noting times and descriptions, even recording video of the trespassers when possible. On Saturday afternoon, he caught 3 different families setting up a full barbecue complete with portable tables, coolers, and lawn chairs. When he approached them, their reactions ranged from embarrassed apologies to outright hostility. The HOA newsletter listed this as a community amenity, insisted one red-faced man in designer sunglasses, waving a glossy printout in Robert's face. "See? Oak Ridge Creek Nature Area. It's right here in black and white." Robert snatched the newsletter and scanned it in disbelief. There it was, prominently featured on the second page. A photo of his creek with text boasting about the newly accessible swimming and recreation area perfect for families. The caption even mentioned plans for future improvements, including a possible deck and picnic facilities. "This is private property," Robert said, his voice trembling with contained fury. "You need to pack up and leave immediately, or I'm calling the sheriff." "You can't be serious," a man's wife interjected, pulling her designer sun hat lower to shade her eyes. The HOA specifically said, I don't give a damn what the HOA said, Robert interrupted. They don't own this land, I do. By Sunday evening, Robert had called the sheriff's department 3 times. Each time, deputies arrived only after long delays, took statements, and issued half-hearted warnings to the trespassers. It was clear they viewed the situation as a minor nuisance rather than a serious property violation. Look, Mr. Mercer, explained the young deputy who responded to his third call, we're stretched thin as it is. Maybe you could put up some no trespassing signs. That would make enforcement easier. The following morning, Robert drove to the hardware store and purchased 24 heavy-duty private PROPRT. No TRES PSNG signs. He spent the entire day installing them along the property line, spacing them every 50 feet to ensure there could be no misunderstanding. He even added additional signs around the creek area with explicit warnings about legal consequences for trespassers. By Tuesday afternoon, half the signs had been removed or vandalized. When Robert called the sheriff's office again, the dispatcher sounded weary. Mr. Mercer, we understand your frustration, but unless you can identify specific individuals, there's not much we can do. That evening, as Robert sat on his porch watching the sunset with a glass of whiskey, his neighbor Frank Jenkins pulled up in his ancient pickup truck. Frank was the only other remaining farmer in the area, his 60 acres bordering Robert's to the north. Heard you're having trouble with those subdivision folks, Frank said without preamble, settling his lanky frame into the rocking chair beside Robert's. That's putting it mildly, Robert replied, pouring his second glass for his friend. They're treating my land like a public park, and the sheriff's department is useless. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Same thing happened to my cousin over in Grant County. Developers built right up against his cattle pasture, then complained about the smell and sued him for decreasing their property values. What did he do? Robert asked, leaning forward. A slow grin spread across Frank's weathered face. Doubled down. Started spreading manure on the field closest to their fancy houses every other day. Eventually, they built a massive privacy fence with their own money and stopped bothering him. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over the farm. Robert's mind was working, processing Frank's story and considering his own options. He couldn't spread manure, his crops wouldn't appreciate it any more than the trespassers would, but the principle was sound. He needed to make his property significantly less appealing without harming anyone or damaging his own livelihood. The next morning, Robert awoke to the sound of machinery. He rushed outside to find a small bulldozer idling at the edge of his property, with Deborah Winters directing a contractor holding blueprints. 3 other HOA board members stood nearby, gesturing toward the creek. What the hell is going on here? Robert bellowed, striding across the field. Deborah turned, her smile unnervingly calm. Good morning, Mr. Mercer. We're just surveying for the footpath improvements. Improvements? On my land? Robert's face flushed crimson. Get that equipment off my property right now, or I'm calling the police. Actually, Deborah replied, extracting a folded document from her designer handbag. We filed for an adverse possession claim with the county. Given the established usage of this pathway by our residents, we have grounds to claim an easement by prescription. She handed him the papers with a triumphant smile. Our attorney advised us that continuing to develop the path strengthens our case. We're simply acting on legal counsel. Robert scanned the document, legal terminology swimming before his eyes. Words like continuous use and hostile claim of right jumped out at him. This is ridiculous, he sputtered. You can't just take someone's land because you decided to trespass on it. The courts may disagree, Deborah replied smoothly, especially when it's for the benefit of over 300 tax-paying families versus, well, just you. As the bulldozer's engine revved impatiently, Robert felt the cold clarity settle over him. The law was supposed to protect property owners, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that the system was stacked against him. The HOA had money, connections, and lawyers. All he had was his land, and they were trying to take even that. He turned without another word and walked back to his house, Deborah's voice calling after him about reasonable accommodation and community benefits. Inside, he went straight to his office and called the only lawyer he knew, his nephew Thomas, who practiced in the city 70 miles away. They can't actually do this, can they? Robert asked after explaining the situation. The long pause on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know before Thomas even spoke. It's complicated, Uncle Rob, Thomas finally said. Adverse possession laws vary, and they need to show years of continuous use, but these developers have deep pockets for legal battles. Even if you win eventually, they could drag it out for years. After hanging up, Robert walked to his kitchen window and stared out at the bulldozer still sitting at the edge of his property. The HOA board members were now taking photos, laughing and pointing toward the creek. That's when the idea hit him. If legal methods wouldn't work, perhaps a more practical approach would. His eyes drifted to the old John Deere backhoe attachment sitting in his equipment shed, unused since he dug the new well 3 years ago. Robert smiled for the first time in days. He knew exactly what to do. Robert spent the remainder of the day in his workshop poring over the property surveys and topographical maps he'd accumulated over 3 decades of farming the land. The creek ran through a natural depression, with the approach from Oak Ridge Estates following a gentle slope down from their property line. Years of agricultural knowledge told him that water always seeks the path of least resistance, and so did trespassers. After dinner, he called his nephew Thomas again. "I need to know something," Robert said without preamble. "If I make modifications to my own land for legitimate agricultural purposes and someone trespassing gets inconvenienced, am I liable?" "What kind of modifications are we talking about?" Thomas asked, wariness evident in his voice. "Drainage ditches," Robert replied, keeping his tone casual. "With all the foot traffic compacting the soil, I'm having water pooling issues near my crops. Need to put in some proper drainage before the next heavy rain." A pause. "Agricultural improvements on your own property are perfectly legal, Uncle Rob. As for trespassers, well, they assume certain risks when entering private property illegally. But I'm legally obligated to advise you not to create deliberate hazards." "Of course not," Robert assured him. "Just normal farm maintenance that happens to require some excavation." After hanging up, Robert walked out to his equipment shed and surveyed the attachments for his tractor. The backhoe hadn't been used in years, but a few hours of maintenance had it functioning smoothly. Next to it sat his trencher, perfect for cutting narrow, deep ditches. A plan was forming in his mind. Not a trap, exactly, but rather a strategic land improvement that would make unwanted visitors think twice about crossing his property. Early the next morning, before dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Robert was already on his tractor. He'd spent half the night sketching plans and calculating measurements, and now it was time to implement them. The steady rumble of the diesel engine was oddly soothing as he began his work along the property line, deliberately positioning himself where the ground dipped slightly before rising toward the creek. His first task was simple enough: a drainage ditch running parallel to the property line, about 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Agricultural necessity, clear as day. He worked methodically, the backhoe carving through the soil with practiced precision. By mid-morning, he had completed a 100-yard trench that effectively cut off the most frequently used access path to his creek. Robert paused to admire his handiwork, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool spring air. The ditch wasn't particularly dangerous, no sharp objects or concealed hazards, but it was certainly an obstacle that would be difficult to cross without getting muddy at the very least. He'd even taken care to keep it a respectful distance from the property line to ensure he wasn't excavating anywhere near the HOA's land. "What the hell are you doing?" A shrill voice cut through the morning air like a knife. Robert turned to see Deborah Winters standing at the edge of his newly dug trench, designer boots already spattered with mud, arms crossed tightly over her chest. 2 other HOA board members stood behind her, along with the contractor he'd seen the day before. "Farm maintenance," Robert replied calmly, shutting off the tractor engine. "Drainage ditch. Gotta protect my fields from water damage." "This is clearly an attempt to block access to the recreation area," Deborah snapped, gesturing angrily at the trench. "This is harassment." Robert climbed down from the tractor, taking his time. "Ma'am, this is a standard agricultural practice on private farmland. I don't recall giving anyone permission to access any recreation area on my property in the first place. We have surveyors and contractors ready to begin work on the pathway. This is a deliberate attempt to interfere with our improvement project." "Improvement project?" Robert echoed, incredulity evident in his tone. "On my land? Without my permission? That sounds an awful lot like trespassing and property damage to me." The contractor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ms. Winters, he's right about one thing. We can't legally begin construction without either his permission or a court order establishing an easement." Deborah's face flushed with anger. "We have a clear case for prescriptive easement. Our residents have been using this path for years." 3 years, Robert corrected, "since your subdivision was built. And I've been actively opposing that use the entire time, as the sheriff's department can verify. That's hardly the open and continuous use without owner opposition that adverse possession requires." Surprise flickered across Deborah's face, quickly replaced by calculated composure. Clearly, she hadn't expected a farmer to be familiar with property law terminology. "This isn't over, Mr. Mercer," she said finally. "The HOA board meets tonight and we'll be discussing our legal options. I suggest you fill in this hazard before someone gets hurt and sues you for everything you're worth." Robert waited until they retreated back toward the subdivision before allowing himself a small smile. Phase 1 was complete. The initial trench would slow them down, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Robert expanded his drainage system with strategic precision. The main ditch now formed a complete semicircle protecting the approach to the creek from the subdivision side. At carefully calculated intervals, he added perpendicular branches, narrower trenches that extended toward his crops like fingers, creating a maze-like pattern that served a genuine agricultural purpose, while making the path to the creek increasingly convoluted. He took careful photographs of his work at each stage, documenting the legitimate agricultural need for improved drainage. Water did indeed flow through the system during a brief rainfall, validating its functional purpose. Robert made sure to install proper culverts and drainage pipes at key points, further emphasizing that this was genuine farm infrastructure, not a trap. By the fourth day, his phone began ringing constantly. First came calls from the County Agricultural Extension Office, responding to complaints about destructive farming practices. Robert calmly explained his drainage improvements and invited them to inspect his work. Next came the Sheriff's Department, concerned about reports of dangerous conditions. Again, Robert welcomed them to visit and see for themselves that he was simply managing water flow on his farm. No one actually showed up to inspect anything. Instead, on the morning of the fifth day, a certified letter arrived from a law firm representing the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. It contained a cease and desist order demanding he halt all earthworks designed to prevent rightful access and restore the land to its previous condition. Robert read the letter twice, then carefully placed it in a folder with his other documentation. His nephew had warned him this might happen, the first step in a potentially lengthy legal battle. But Thomas had also advised him that continuing his legitimate agricultural improvements would strengthen his position, not weaken it. That afternoon, Robert began the final phase of his plan. This would be the masterpiece, positioned directly across what remained of the main path to the creek. Not just a simple trench this time, but something special, something that would send a clear message about trespassing on Mercer farmland. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his fields, Robert worked with renewed energy. From the road, passers-by might see only a farmer tending to his land. But Robert knew he was creating something more, a perfect defense against entitlement and disrespect. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that practically begged people to spend time outdoors. Robert rose before sunrise, made a pot of strong coffee, and settled onto his front porch with a pair of binoculars. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of both his intricate trench system and the edge of Oak Ridge Estates, where residents typically entered his property. The final phase of his plan had been completed late Friday afternoon, a masterpiece of rural engineering that Robert was particularly proud of. At the heart of his drainage system now lay what he called the retention basin, a broad, shallow depression about 20 feet in diameter and 2 feet deep. Unlike the other trenches, which he had left bare earth, he had carefully lined this basin with heavy plastic sheeting, then covered it with a thin layer of soil and scattered grass clippings on top. To anyone approaching from the subdivision, it looked like solid ground, just a slight dip in the landscape. But Robert knew that the recent rains had saturated the soil beneath the plastic, turning it into a slick, muddy quagmire that would give way instantly under any weight. Not deep enough to be dangerous, but certainly deep enough to be memorable. Around 9:30 a.m., the first trespassers appeared, a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever carrying a picnic basket and beach towels. Robert watched through his binoculars as they approached his property line, paused at the site of the first trench, then began following it, looking for a way across. Eventually, they found one of the narrow spots where Robert had deliberately left a crossing point, a deceptively simple way through his defenses that would lead them directly toward the retention basin. The couple crossed the first trench cautiously, then picked their way through the maze of smaller ditches, clearly determined to reach the creek. Robert had to admire their persistence, even as he waited for the inevitable. Sure enough, they followed the path of least resistance exactly as he had predicted, heading straight for the disguised basin. The man stepped onto the camouflaged surface first, took 2 confident strides, and then suddenly disappeared up to his knees in mud. His shock yelp echoed across the field as he struggled to maintain his balance, arms windmilling wildly. The woman grabbed for him, only to step onto the edge of the basin herself and sink ankle-deep into the muck. The dog, excited by what it clearly thought was a game, bounded into the middle of the basin and became instantly stuck, barking joyfully despite being mud-covered up to its belly. Only the toddler remained clean, having been set down safely before his parents' misadventure. The child stood at the edge of the basin, giggling hysterically at the adult's predicament. Robert couldn't help but chuckle at the scene. The couple spent nearly 15 minutes extricating themselves and their dog, all 3 covered in thick, clinging mud. Their picnic forgotten, they retreated toward Oak Ridge Estates, the woman carrying the protesting toddler while the man struggled with a mud-caked dog. By noon, word had clearly spread through the subdivision, but oddly, this didn't discourage visitors. It seemed to increase them. Groups of teenagers arrived, clearly having heard about the mud pit and eager to see it for themselves. Some deliberately stomped into the basin, turning it into an impromptu mud wrestling arena while their friends recorded videos on their phones. Not quite the deterrent Robert had intended, but entertaining nonetheless. Around 2 p.m., the mood shifted dramatically with the arrival of Deborah Winters and what appeared to be the entire HOA board. 6 people in total, all dressed inappropriately for farm conditions in their weekend casual wear that likely cost more than Robert's monthly expenses. They approached the property line with determined strides, Deborah in the lead clutching a rolled document that Robert assumed was the cease and desist letter. Through his binoculars, Robert watched their faces transform from confidence to confusion as they encountered the first trench. Unlike the earlier visitors, they seemed unwilling to look for crossings, instead following the perimeter with visible frustration. Deborah appeared to be giving directions, gesturing emphatically toward the creek. Finally, one of the men in the group, Robert recognized him as the HOA vice president, a retired insurance executive named Gerald Thompson, spotted one of the crossing points. He waved the others over, and the group filed across the narrow land bridge, then began navigating through the maze of smaller trenches. Robert set down his binoculars and headed down from the porch, deciding it was time for a closer look. He took his time walking through his fields, inspecting crops as he went, positioning himself to intercept the HOA contingent just as they approached the retention basin. "Afternoon, folks," he called out when he was within earshot. "I'd be careful where you step if I were you. Ground's a bit unstable after all that rain we had." Deborah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing when she spotted him. "Mr. Mercer, this has gone far enough. We have legal documents requiring you to cease this sabotage of our community access immediately." She thrust the rolled papers toward him, taking another step forward directly onto the camouflaged edge of the retention basin. The effect was instantaneous. The thin layer of soil gave way beneath her weight, and she plunged knee-deep into the hidden mud with a shriek of surprise and outrage. The documents flew from her hand, landing in the center of the basin, where they quickly began to absorb the moisture and sink. "Ms. Winters." Gerald Thompson lunged forward to help her, only to suffer the same fate, sinking to mid-thigh in the viscous mud. His momentum carried him forward, and he lost his balance completely, falling face first into the muck with a spectacular splash. The remaining board members froze in place, horror evident on their faces as they watched their leadership literally sink into Robert's trap. One woman in white linen pants took a hesitant step backward, lost her footing on the slippery edge of one of the smaller trenches, and sat down hard in the dirt with a yelp. "Oh my," Robert said mildly, making no move to help. "Seems like you folks have found my new agricultural retention basin. It's designed to collect runoff water and prevent erosion. Agricultural necessity, you understand." You did this deliberately," Deborah sputtered, struggling to extract herself from the mud. Her designer outfit was ruined, caked with thick soil that clung to every surface. This is assault." "Not at all," Robert replied calmly. "This is a legitimate agricultural improvement on private property. The real question is what you folks are doing trespassing on my land after receiving multiple warnings." "We have rights to access," Gerald began, but Robert cut him off. "You have no rights here," he said firmly. "This is private property, not a public park. And now you're trespassing, destroying crops, and interfering with agricultural operations." As if on cue, the distant sound of a siren could be heard, growing steadily louder. Robert smiled. "That'll be Sheriff Davis," he said. "I called him about 20 minutes ago to report trespassers. Again." You! Deborah was nearly speechless with rage as she finally managed to extract one leg from the mud, only to lose her balance and sit down hard in the muck. "Careful there," Robert advised. "That mud's deeper in the middle." By the time Sheriff Davis arrived, the scene had descended into chaos. Deborah and Gerald remained stuck in the retention basin, both covered in mud from the waist down. 2 other board members had fallen into smaller trenches while trying to help or retreat. Only one had managed to stay clean, a nervous-looking man in a polo shirt who stood frozen in place, afraid to move in any direction. Sheriff Davis surveyed the scene from the edge of Robert's property, his expression a mixture of disbelief and poorly concealed amusement. "Mr. Mercer," he called out, "care to explain what's going on here?" Robert ambled over to the sheriff, hands in his pockets. "Well, Sheriff, I've been implementing some agricultural improvements to manage." The lawsuit arrived 3 days later, just as Robert had expected. The thick envelope contained a formal complaint filed on behalf of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, alleging everything from malicious entrapment to reckless endangerment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The HOA was demanding $250,000 in damages plus court costs. Robert called his nephew Thomas immediately. "They're really going through with it," Robert said, a hint of disbelief in his voice despite having anticipated this very outcome. "Claiming I deliberately created hazardous conditions to injure innocent community members." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Send me everything. The lawsuit, your documentation, those photos you took, all of it. And don't worry too much yet. This is mostly intimidation tactics. Can they win? Robert asked bluntly. Honestly, it's complicated. They got money and connections, but you got something better. You're in the right and you've documented everything meticulously. Thomas paused. Plus, there's something about entitled suburbanites getting stuck in mud that tends to make rural judges unsympathetic to their complaints. True to Thomas' prediction, the initial hearing 2 weeks later went surprisingly well for Robert. The HOA's attorney, a slick corporate lawyer from the city, presented blown-up photographs of Deborah Winters and Gerald Thompson, covered in mud, describing the dangerous conditions and malicious intent behind Robert's actions. When it was Thomas' turn, he simply presented Robert's documentation chronologically: the initial trespassing incidents, the multiple calls to the sheriff's department, the no trespassing signs that had been vandalized, and finally, the HOA newsletter explicitly listing Roberts Creek as a community amenity. Most damning was the letter from the HOA stating their intent to build a path across his property without his permission. Your Honor, Thomas concluded, my client implemented standard agricultural drainage improvements on his own property after documenting significant soil compaction from unauthorized foot traffic. These improvements serve a legitimate agricultural purpose as confirmed by the County Agricultural Extension Office. He held up a letter from the county agent who had finally inspected Robert's work. If trespassers chose to ignore clearly posted private property signs and then found themselves in a muddy situation, that's unfortunate, but hardly my client's responsibility. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had grown up on a dairy farm before pursuing law, peered over her reading glasses at the HOA attorney. Counselor, your clients were trespassing on clearly marked private property after multiple warnings. Am I correct? The attorney shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, my clients believed they had established rights to access. Yes or no, please, Judge Harmon interrupted. Technically, yes, but... And Mr. Mercer's drainage system serves a legitimate agricultural purpose according to the County Agricultural Office. The timing and placement of these so-called improvements make it clear they were designed specifically to... Yes or no, Counselor? The attorney sighed. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Harmon nodded. I'm dismissing the claims of malicious entrapment and reckless endangerment. Mr. Mercer had every right to improve his own property, and your clients had no right to be there in the first place. She shuffled her papers. However, I am allowing the case to proceed on the narrower question of whether the specific design of the retention basin, with its camouflage appearance, constituted an unreasonable hazard even to trespassers. It wasn't a complete victory, but Robert left the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. The judge had made it clear she wasn't sympathetic to the HOA's position, even if legal technicalities required the case to continue. What Robert hadn't anticipated was the media attention. Somehow, the story of a farmer trapping HOA board members in a mud pit had caught the imagination of local news outlets. By the end of the week, Farmer vs. HOA, the Great Mud Trap Showdown, had become the lead story on every local station. Public opinion swung decisively in Robert's favor when videos emerged on social media. The teenagers who had turned his retention basin into a mud wrestling arena had recorded everything, including clear footage of the no trespassing signs and Deborah Winters' spectacular fall into the mud while threatening Robert with legal papers. The county commissioner's office was flooded with calls and emails supporting Robert. Letters to the editor in the local newspaper overwhelmingly sided with the farmer protecting his land from entitled suburbanites. One political cartoonist drew a particularly brutal caricature of Deborah Winters sinking in mud while clutching a sign reading, "Rules don't apply to me." Perhaps most surprising was the reaction from many Oak Ridge Estates residents themselves. The day after the first court hearing, Robert found a handwritten note in his mailbox signed by over 50 homeowners, apologizing for the HOA's actions and distancing themselves from the lawsuit. Most of us never knew they were claiming your creek as HOA property, one resident wrote. We're horrified by their behavior and want you to know we respect your property rights. 3 days before the next scheduled court date, Robert received an unexpected visit from Gerald Thompson, without Deborah Winters. Mr. Mercer, Gerald began awkwardly, standing at Robert's front door and pointedly not setting foot on the porch without invitation. I wonder if we might have a word. Robert gestured him in, curious despite his wariness. Once seated in Robert's living room, Gerald got straight to the point. The HOA board held an emergency meeting last night. Deborah has been asked to step down as president. I see, Robert replied neutrally. The truth is, Mr. Mercer, this whole situation has become untenable. The lawsuit is costing us a fortune, the residents are in open revolt against the board, and frankly, Gerald grimaced. Well, we were wrong. Plain and simple. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. I've been authorized to offer you this settlement. We'll drop all legal claims against you, issue a formal apology, and compensate you for damages to your crops from trespassing. In return, we ask only that you consider filling in some of the deeper trenches, not because you have to, but as a good faith gesture, once this is all resolved. Robert read through the settlement carefully. The terms were surprisingly favorable. The HOA would pay for all of his legal expenses plus $10,000 for crop damages, issue a written apology to be published in the community newsletter, and commit to educating all residents about respecting neighboring property boundaries. Why the change of heart? Robert asked, genuinely curious. Gerald sighed heavily. Beyond the obvious public relations disaster, we received a letter from our insurance company yesterday. They're refusing to cover any of our legal expenses for this lawsuit, citing our willful and knowing trespass as grounds for denial of coverage. He shook his head ruefully. Turns out I should have read our policy more carefully before letting Deborah lead us into this mess. 2 days later, Robert signed the settlement agreement in Thomas' office. Congratulations, Thomas said, clapping his uncle on the shoulder. Not many people stand up to these developers and HOAs, and even fewer win. I'm just glad it's over, Robert replied, though he couldn't help feeling a certain satisfaction. In the weeks that followed, peace returned to Robert's farm. The trenches remained, though he did smooth out the retention basin as a goodwill gesture, after documenting its effectiveness during several rainstorms to justify its agricultural purpose. The new HOA board, now led by Gerald Thompson, proved surprisingly reasonable. They erected their own fence along the property line at their expense with a large sign explicitly stating that the creek area was private property and not for resident use. They even consulted Robert before planting a buffer made of shrubs and trees along the fence to provide privacy for both parties. On a warm evening in late summer, Robert sat on his porch watching the sunset, a glass of whiskey in hand. Frank Jenkins pulled up in his truck for their now regular evening chat.